but they have already determined what the action is that they're going to do. We have, I've been involved in transportation planning in Toronto now for 4 years. During that time, we barely done any transportation, but I've made a fortune out of transportation plans. And this is not okay. So there clearly is an imbalance in Western cities in their ability to be able to respond to challenges like this. And at the same point, what I do see is that more adventurous cities, New York, Manchester, London, Paris to some extent, are actually trying to evolve a new way of doing business, which allows the big and necessary idea to be expressed and realized through this incredibly polymorphous, complicated political system.
What I would bring back from China is the investment in infrastructure. Just a second, what Joe has been saying. The high-speed rail system is a magnificent achievement. We can't even think about it in the United States. Our government offered funds to various parts of the country for high-speed rail, and it was mostly turned down by the governors. The new transit systems, underground transit systems, huge investment in that. By 2040, 2050, 20 or 30 of big cities in China will have the equivalent of New York City's and London's underground transit systems, the highway systems. It's just amazing the level of accomplishment and the priorities that the government has set on infrastructure, which none of it, their competitors in other parts of the world have begun to reach at all.
Yes. I'm going to bring an African perspective on this question. I think the last time there was a major investments in African urbanization, largely fueled by, well, Western ideas, was shortly after independence in the late 60s and early 70s, when a number of new African cities, the new African urbanization happened. And this was a time when commodity prices were high due to the Middle Eastern conflicts, and credit was cheap. And the newly independent African countries wanted to build a new style African cities, post-colonial cities. Massive investment went into building new towns like Lilongwe, Shura, all over Africa, probably half a dozen new cities. That was the last time major, I think, major influence particularly from Western companies that built and did the planning of these cities, had a major impact on African urbanization. What it resulted in was massive debts when interest rates went up in the late 70s and early 80s, and some of the massive indebtedness of African countries is largely fueled by that early spate of new African cities that were being built. Now we're in curiously coming out of, let's say, a similar period with certainly through the last 5-6 years, maybe the last 10 years, high commodity prices, low interest rates, and China is now exporting new city models to Africa. This is to some extent, I think, what we have to learn from was the experience of that first spate of new African cities. Now we call them smart cities and global cities, but I think the philosophy behind them was similar, and we need to really look at, if we want to look at sustainable urbanization, we have to learn from certainly the first round of new African urbanism was not really sustainable.
That's great. It's a good context for the situation in Africa, but I still wanted to push a little bit harder on the question about if there was one thing that you would like to export from Africa to the West, what would that thing be and why?
Well, I think from Africa, what we have to the contribution of African urbanization is the are the social movements, the slum dwellers international movement, where slum communities are demanding their stake in the right to the city, largely inspired actually by Latin America and the Brazilians and the urban reform movements in the from the 90s and for the last 20 years. But I think we see this, I'm coming from a human settlement civil society perspective, and this is what I think is exciting, and I think this is the dialogue that, and even China has to learn from Africa around social movements and the demand for the poor for their right to the city.
Well, perfectly honestly, I don't want to bring anything big back from China. I'll be very honest. I think there's so many little things I'd like to bring back from China, actually. So the big things, they're conventional. We've got metro systems, we've got high-speed rail systems. Yes, they're wonderful and big and highly developed. They can be done elsewhere in the world. Surely we're not about to say we're going to bring an autocratic system in order to create those kinds of wonderful things that we need. I can't believe it. Is this the only way we can achieve those very conventional urban improvements? No, there's nothing big I want to bring back from China. There are wonderful traditional environments, a history that goes back thousands of years, wonderful spaces, way of living. It's absolutely amazing, and I need to be there. I miss it when I'm not in China. Those are the kinds of things I'd like to bring here. I don't want to bring anything big.
John stole my thunder because it's almost exactly what I was going to say. Very interesting. So I also think that again, the big things, the current big things that are happening now in China are largely, coming from here, right? I don't want to bring it back. But that I think that what China, even though it's being lost, what Chinese culture and society have that the U.S. and Europe and Canada and so on could gain is in fact wonderfully sophisticated and kind of uplifting ways of dealing with high density with very small things. For example, like the market there, having 150 little tiny noodle shops and restaurants, street food, and the sense of culture that comes with, and people's relationship to that. Although this issue of the Western concept of public space is complicated, people's ability in China to live in high density and to live outside their homes, which is something that's kind of been celebrated a lot in Japan, but less so for China, is also very admirable and is a model for sustainability. This idea that you can use the city in a very domestic, intimate way, even though you're surrounded by millions of people. And I think that, I'm afraid that that's what's being lost. And that's like one of the most valuable things I think China has to offer the world, is this sort of way of urban life that is quite wonderful, really, and is missing in much of Western society.
Professor Wu, yes,
the conference is very, for me, it's very surprising. What's the meaning that here? Normally, we didn't think about what is really the model, the Chinese economic model. What is really the Chinese urbanization model? Why the Africa, the French learn from the Chinese urbanization very quickly. So recent years, we just think about that. We have some problem, especially economical development very fast, but we have some large a lot of the problem, such as environment and housing, transportation, and so on. But according to the different the presentation, most of them see the Chinese organization, the model is good. The model. Some of them saw the China's organization is the critical review. We have some problems, especially it's not really, I think it's not really the globalization, but this is a trend of the globalization. So we learn from the West country and use the Chinese the model, and then from the east part to the west parts. And nowadays it's very surprised, from China to Africa. This is the problem. I think we have to think about what is really the China's urbanization model. What is good? What is bad? I think it's very important for this conference.
So, Professor Gu, I want to push hard on you as I push hard on everybody else. So, if there is one element in the Chinese model that you think that can be introduced to the West for the West to learn from, and what will that element be in the Chinese model? Just one element.
I think as Deng Xiaoping said, the development is very important.
Okay. Development is you mean economic development?
Yeah.
Okay, economic development is very important. Okay, so then apparently you're doing some thinking, and while all our participants are discussing about that question. So I guess you probably have the second round of question for us to.
Well, why don't we just reverse it and change the what does the West? In other words, what we see, is it really? What we think we see, is it really what we see? And what are the key things that the West has to offer in this kind of massive urbanization that's happening in China and ultimately in Africa? So should we start in the same order with Joe?
Okay, well, you don't like my big coming back here, but I'll tell you what I want is small going the other way. I think that there's a lot of very interesting projects that are going on all over the Western world, which is kind of reinvention of the 60s public housing development. So Regent Park in Toronto, and when we were involved in Manchester Hume project there. And what all of them were trying to do was essentially reintroduce some of the more, I guess you'd say traditional, the street grid, the active ground floor space, the mix of uses, the short block, essentially the Jane Jacobs vocabulary. And I think in the rush to urbanization, again, really can only speak of Singapore and Hong Kong, that small quality, that one architectural quality, which you see in the older traditional city in all of those places, got eroded. And it actually, it's a trick, but you could put it back in quite easily. And an architectural and urban design trick, and I think that's what I'd like to see. Is that okay?
Jonathan?
Well, I think what maybe, I hesitate to say it because we have lost ground ourselves from too much of it, but market discipline. There's an awful lot of development in China which is taking place with no discernible market. A lot of small cities or large cities are investing capital in buildings which are really not occupied. And one of the things that works for American cities to some extent is that there's a tremendous amount of diversity because people are willing to try to meet the market. The obverse of that is that you're not prepared to do anything that doesn't have a market. And that's why we don't seem to be able to imagine that in 25 years people will want to ride a high-speed rail line. There's helping the planning right now. So our model can't be transported back to China intact, it seems to me, because it comes with a lot of built-in problems. But the discipline of the market is something that needs to be applied to real estate development in China in order to make it more adaptable and more related to what people actually need.
Maybe take up from Jonathan's point. I think again, looking at this from an African perspective, the way Chinese cities have got financed, built on commercial real estate markets, but and that China adapted from a Western capitalist model, but in a socialist country where land is owned by the state, adapted a model that still used private real estate capital to fund urban expansion. I think is an interesting market model that may be interesting for African countries, particularly, as I mentioned at lunchtime, the post-socialist African countries that have a similar land legislation like Angola and Mozambique, probably Ethiopia, Tanzania, and a number of other African countries, where the Chinese urban infrastructure was largely funded by land value capture. I think this is there's an opportunity in learning from the positive and the negative aspects of land value capture. To some extent, some Chinese cities have exhausted that traditional form of land value capture because there's no more space in the market. The fact that so much was built that there was no demand for, that created in some cities real estate bubbles. Now, one doesn't want to transfer that those negative experiences to Africa, but there are opportunities in learning for positive use of land value capture, and one of them that UN Habitat has been promoting and that we've been testing in Angola has been participatory land readjustment, and this is a process of using state, private sector, and even informal sector land occupants in using land transformation to capture the value of land to invest in social infrastructure. And there are lessons from China that could be adapted, probably not copied, but adapted in Africa, particularly, as I said, in the post-socialist countries.
Well, what I'd like to export, I guess, to China is some measure of democracy. I think the planning process needs more democratic process in China. About a year ago, I gave a talk on bottom-up development in China. I did this big survey. I was looking for examples where top-down planning authority had not intervened or had failed to intervene, and it was a bottom-up process, often quite successful. So I gave this talk, I didn't publish it, but it was a long talk, 2.5 hours, a public lecture on it. And it's a kind of democracy that seems to me can work. So I'd like to see the planning system in China become a little more flexible, a lot more flexible, actually. This very rigid top-down authoritative decision-making leads to a lot of errors, in my opinion, just observing over these last 20 years, a huge number of errors, and sort of going off track quite often. So the big picture may be good, the total direction may be right, but so many times they just go off the rails. and huge money is lost, and all kinds of problems there. I just like to see more bottom-up development. It's good, it's creative, it promotes the feeling among people that they can contribute. They don't have to just wait for a decision to come down from on high. And that's how you get a creative city. China has to have creative cities and has to develop creative industry. I don't know how it can happen with a very rigid top-down decision-making authority. So there it is, a little bit of democracy.
I agree with Alan's new point. Africa, current new topic. We Chinese people always learn from try to find the solution. The Chinese organization, the rules. During I think it's more than 100 years, the Chinese people always find the solution from the the political systems, the economic systems, or even if the planning systems, especially during these times, we just try to find the transformation of the planning system between the urban planning, economic planning, and the land use planning. We want to the integration all the economical and land use and the spatial the plans. But this is the socialist the marketing systems under the socialist system. We divide different elements in the spatial, economical, and the land use. So we need we call it the deep reform of in China. We need the deep reform. I think we should change the transform of the planning systems. So why? What is the reason? As because we have a lot of the problems under the socialist marketing system. So we want to find another solutions.
So it's a little difficult because it's very easy to be critical of the things done in North America as well. But I think that they, and again, kind of on the same page with John, that public discourse on planning, public discussion of planning issues, transparency, and openness to to more sensitivity to local issues, as I was saying in my talk, locally appropriate and locally sensitive approaches to planning, which always can help resolve the conversation, and especially some kind of open public debate about it. That it's okay to have newspaper articles that are critical of the project and that sort of thing. I think is really important in moving ahead in building the kind of vibrant cities in a way that are going to keep the economic model rolling. Oddly enough, one issue with China is that China is participating now in an increasingly competitive market to attract global investment and global capital. And even now, there's some stories about a lot of places in China kind of pricing themselves out now. People are trying to look at Bangladesh or whatever, someplace else to manufacture. And one thing I think that happens is, because I talk sometimes with business people about these things, is that China becomes monolithic. It's just China, right? So is China a good place to invest or not? It's not a Shanghai or Beijing or Lanzhou, it's China, right? And a lot of Chinese cities could position themselves much better. In fact, I think if they would build more of a unique identity for themselves, unique image, and something that's reflective of their local strengths and weaknesses, rather than just yes, we've reached the same standard of education, infrastructure, and whatever else as Beijing or Shanghai. It would be much better to be more locally sensitive.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting because I'm being a planner who worked in China and yeah, for a long time before I came to Canada. It's like in search for a local identity has always been a theme in planning anyways. The challenge has always been that in the process of in searching for identity, a local identity, we sort of always looking for examples from elsewhere. Or the other way around is to dig deep into the ground and to see what is this place about, is okay, so the history and the culture and those kind of things. So, but anyways, I was reminded by our chair of the co-conference and that we only have about 10 minutes left for the next round of conversation. So my next question will be, and I think we have already touched on that, and this seems to be a theme of this conference anyway. So planning in a scientific way sounds very familiar to the Chinese planners, and planning in a democratic way sounds very familiar with the Western planners. How can we mingle these two? And where is the fine line between the two? And I don't imply that there will be a universal answer to that question, but I guess it really depends on the circumstances, depends on the culture, the conditions, and the time as well. So what is good for 2012 and 15 may or may not be good for 1989 anyways. I'm just picking up that specific time quite deliberately. Anyways, so with that, should I pass the microphone to Joe again? Because I think you talked about that, about scientific, because it is quite rare, to be honest with you. I have been working for the city of Ottawa for about 12 years. It's almost an evil thing to say science, which is in planning world. It's kind of planning is all about what's your opinion, what's your purpose, what's your purpose. It's almost evil for me as a planner to walk into a planning consultation meeting to say, here is the science of planning, because it is actually politically incorrect for me to assume certain level of authority in planning, even though I have been working in planning for about 25 years in different places. So with that, I will pass this microphone to you. And
okay, well, assume the authority. That's the thing. When I teach at the School of Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto, and our graduates get an MSc. I think I said this morning that it's, at best, planning is a soft science, and that any proposition that you might want to put forward as being a planning truth is actually a very interesting thing. I'll try to write down and say, well, what are planning truths, as you could do in any other scientific profession. Anything you're going to say is going to be about 2/3 right. But there are a lot of things that I think are 2/3 right in planning about the relationship between transportation and land use, about the way in which development hits the ground, relates to the street, about the need for mix, about the need for big, medium, and small. When you start to look at it, there's actually quite a lot of stuff that is, you can actually fashion into a bunch of propositions. And as in all things, there are factions of these. And so Robert Moses gets replaced by Jane Jacobs, who in turn is going to get replaced by Bloomberg. And so you can see these waves running through the system. The difficulty that I've had, certainly it's much less true now, but certainly there are a couple of decades, the 80s and the 90s, when planning was essentially being a community dictaphone. And I think those are lost decades, because ultimately there is the authority there's the knowledge, or actually the wisdom there. But there's certainly not the ability to do anything with what you've got when you make it. So it's a fascinating process. I mean, I think where I've come to with this is that there is something that planners and city builders have to say that makes it pretty much sense most of the time, but they should never be able to say that as the exclusive voice. You always have to have a check and balance in the system, and you have to make sure that check is balanced in the right way. And I think that position of balance moves over time. That's what I'm going to say on that. Thank you.
Jonathan.
Well, let's look at two pieces of this question in two pieces. One is what is scientific about planning. And it seems to me that in China, we need to look to the middle of this coming this century and say, okay, in 2050, when the prediction is the population in China will have stabilized, that what is this population? What is the, obviously all these predictions are at some level not scientific, but they're all very significant. What is going to happen with climate change? What are reasonable guesses that you can make about what is going to happen to coastal cities in China? What's going to happen to food security? I'm very concerned as an observer of China that China has been too dependent on importing food from other places, which is, I think, not sustainable because in a worldwide food shortage, the other places are going to kick the food back, no matter who owns the land. In any case, it seems to me there needs to be a program, as scientific as possible, about where China is going in the next 25 or 30 years. What I feel about China is that the process of urbanization has been so rapid, and it's rather like riding a runaway horse. That the government is still in the saddle, but the horse is not getting the direction that it really ought to have. And so getting out in front of the horse, now drop this comparison, but getting out in front of the situation, trying to establish what the constraints are going to be in the mid-century is, I think, very important. Then I think there is the question of democracy. And it's a complicated, I don't think Americans can come into China and say, what you need is our system. We did this in Russia, and that didn't really work very well. So, I don't know how you do this. So maybe the Singapore model has something to recommend it. But it seems to me, in the end, people in these countries, in China, have to understand what the long-range problems are. They have to be conversant with them, and they have to be involved in their solution. And I don't know how to do this, but I don't think that was the question. So I was sister would ask you the question about answering it.
I think it's interesting if we look at scientific approaches and democracy together. I think the big change that has happened in the last decade or so has been the transformation of information systems, geographic information systems, technological ICTs that actually make technology much more participatory, where now we're involved with a number of programs in Southern Africa working around the concept of co-ownership of information, where information is collected together, data, information that is needed for planning by communities together with local government, and validated by both, so that information is trusted by both at the local level, communities, local government, and national government. And we're using some of these technologies in measuring the impact of the Millennium Goals and now adapting them for the new Sustainable Development Goals, where communities get involved in the process of validating scientifically data that is important for urban planning. Now, some of the ideas go back to 20, 25 years ago, Robert Chambers' ideas. Robert Chambers made a fascinating presentation about 15 years ago across the street at the university here. And I think some of his ideas about participatory diagnostic and community ownership of data now has been really, power has been given to those ideas in adapting PDAs and cell phones and smartphones, so that communities can actually participate in the creation of information and working with planners on validating this information.
That's great, thank you. John? I think urban planning has a really weak scientific foundation. Through its 100 years of history, its 100 years history, it has been a practice. And a lot of those practices are not really evaluated in practice. So we don't really know what has been successful other than very anecdotally. So I think the science of urban planning is really weak. I'd like it to be a lot stronger. And I actually sort of devote my research career to that, to trying to contribute to this foundation. I'd like it to be more scientific, but let's face it, our urban planning has been, it certainly is the case in China, and was the case here until the public participation wave that's happened, is technocratic. And technocratic does not mean scientific. So we just need to make that distinction. So I know, I hear it a lot in China. We want a scientific approach. We want science, science, science. In fact, it's not. It's technocratic. So we need to really be careful about this. If a leader says, prove that this will work, and we're hearing this now in China. I'm so glad to be hearing this. Actually, when the leader says to the institute that's presenting the plan, show me the proof that this is going to work the way you say it's going to work. You know, people get very nervous. We would get very nervous as urban planners in Canada as well. We don't have those methods to predict outcomes so carefully as is being demanded now. Anyway, that's my point.
Thank you.
Last year, I have a paper talk about the transformation of the Chinese urban planning system, published in the urban planning design. I divide into the four periods. First one, before the 1911, we can call the traditional Chinese urban planning. During the 1911 to the 1949, the mix of the traditional Chinese urban planning and the West country systems. During the 1949 to the 1978, the Chinese urban planning the system learned a lot from the Russian, the Soviet system. After that, we changed the mind. We learned from the Western country, not only from the America, even as the Portugal and Spanish, and we learned a lot. Yeah. But nowadays, we have to think about that. What is what kind of the urban system the China need? The climate change and the eco-city and some others. I have two courses in Tsinghua University. One is the planning theory and the practice. Another one is the planning research methodology. So I think I talk about the students. What is really the planning, the approach? I think it's firstly is engineering. In recent years in China, engineering is very important. Secondly, it's the science approach. But human and the social science approach is also very important. So not really just the science. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Well,
That's fine.
You're good? Okay. I think that with that, we'll conclude the session, and I want to go around and thank all of our participants, Jonathan Barnett, Alan Kane, John Zacharias, Joe Barrage, Piper Gallitz, on behalf of, and Mr. Goop. Thank you all very much for participating in this session. I assume that the issues and ideas that we're discussing here will be discussed by many others in a variety of ways over the next 24 hours or so. So I look forward to seeing all of you in other sessions as we go. Thank you very much for spending your time with us, and thank you all for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you. like talk, there was a concern about